Kennewick Man's remains were discovered on the bank of the Columbia River in Washington. His discovery now opened the door for speculation of whether or not Native Americans were in fact the first Americans. Many archaeologists believed that his features resembled that of a Caucasian male and stood firmly by this assumption. However, members of the Umatilla tribe, as well as four other local tribes, believed that any human remains found along the Columbia River had to be Native American. This now sparked the debate of who should have possession over this man's remains between scientists and Native Americans. The scientists wanted the remains to conduct further research and to prove whether or not the Native Americans were here first, and the Native Americans wanted them because they believed the grave and remains were being desecrated by the scientists. They wanted the Kennewick Man's remains to return where they were found and remain undisturbed. But the question still stands, who deserves possession over the Kennewick Man's remains? During the 19th century, many anthropologists believed race could be biologically determined and therefore scientifically proven that some races are biologically inferior to others. In this instance, they used this to prove how Native Americans were inferior to the white Americans. Samuel George Morton was an anthropologist who used skull science to prove the Native Americans inferior. He believed that the human skull was completely unaffected by outside factors, and its size could also determine race and cognitive power. The larger the skull, the larger the brain, which leads to a more intelligent individual, and if the skull was smaller, this meant that the individual was less intelligent. Through this science, Morton was capable of proving that Native American skulls were significantly smaller. The difference in size was apparently enough to determine that Native Americans simply did not have the mental capacity to become civilized beings to live in harmony with white Americans. This new evidence only helped fuel racist stereotypes of Native Americans as violent, savage redskins, who simply did not have the ability to change on their own and assimilate into white American ways. These racist stereotypes later led the U.S. government to come to the conclusion that the only way Native Americans could be saved is through forced assimilation into mainstream American culture. Richard Pratt was an important figure for this because he created a school for Native Americans. Young boys were taken from their tribes and put into these schools, where they were taught the ways of typical Americans in order to turn them into upstanding American citizens. However, the only way to do this was to completely strip them of their Native American culture, including their religion and language. These schools were designed to kill the Indian and save the man. As the boys arrived, their hair was cut, and they removed them of their traditional Indian garb once they were at the schools. Pratt believed that it only made sense to first remove their outer identity by cutting their hair and giving them American uniforms to more easily force them into a new American identity. Forcing the Native Americans into a completely new and foreign environment and removing them of their identity left them defenseless in these new schools where they had no choice but to assume the new role that was imposed upon them. Another instance of the United States government completely disregarding Native American culture and traditions was their complete lack of respect for their burial grounds. The government allowed museums to launch their own collecting expeditions to retrieve Native American skulls and skeletons. In order to do this, anthropologists would often dig up their graves and cut off the heads of Native Americans to bring them back to the museums. There were instances of grave robbing the same day the Native American died. Hundreds of skulls were stolen and sometimes even sold as if they did not once belong to a human being. The desecration of graves was a constant occurrence, and this is what supplied many museums with Native American skull and skeleton collections that can still be viewed today. It is no question that Native Americans have had nothing but negative experiences with anthropologists and the United States government. The Native Americans dealt with negative racial stereotypes, cultural genocide, and complete disrespect for their way of life. They were slaughtered and almost exterminated. This was all due to the sole fact that Native Americans were different from white Americans. The discovery of Kennewick Man is just another reminder of everything the Native Americans had to and still have to endure. His removal from the ground is another grave desecrated to them. Race is not something that can be biologically proven, and it is not something that can be proven by how someone looks or does not look. To say Kennewick Man's skull does not resemble modern-day Indian skulls makes perfect sense because his remains are nearly 10,000 years old. Why should his skull resemble that of a modern Native American's? The Native Americans have endured enough suffering and disrespect from both the United States government and anthropologists. Therefore, I believe that the Native Americans should have claim over the Kennewick Man's remains.